I once heard a definition of faith as looking at people that we love, that we see, living a life that we're fascinated by. Not because, they can catch footballs crazily or something like this, but because they live a life that we see as worth living. And faith being saying, I want to know how they do that. For me, it was my grandmother. And when she would talk about how she became this way and everything, she would always point to Jesus. And that's kind of how it goes. I would look and point to her, and she would look and point to Jesus. And so what I was really pointing at was always Jesus, right? Today we're going to be talking in the book of Revelation, chapter 14, about a lot of things that are always in the end pointing to Jesus in some way or the other. So if you would, let's begin in a word of prayer. Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, our Lord, our rock, and our Redeemer. Amen. Since it's such a big deal, let's talk about, this is going to be tough. All right, hexakoisoi, hexakonta, hexaphobia. I used to think disestablishmentarianism or anti-disestablishmentarianism was the longest word in the Bible, or not in the Bible, but in the world, in English at least. But I do wonder if it might not be hexakoisoi, hexakonta, hexaphobia. All right, there it is. Hexakoisoi, hexakonta, hexaphobia. It's literally just a transliteration of the Greek. The Greek for 6. Next slide. Hexakoisoi, 6. All right, and I guess you can guess the next one. 6. And what's next? 6. Do you feel evil? Hexakoisoi, hexakonta, hexaphobia. The fear of the number 666. Then I saw another beast that rose out of the earth. Revelation 13, verse 11 says, it had 2 horns. 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and it makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound had been healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth. It deceives the inhabitants of the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that had been wounded. Also, it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both slave and free, to be marked on the right hand or the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell who does not have the mark. That is the name of the beast, or the number of its name. This, John says, calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person. Its number is hexakonta, hexakoisoi, not hexaphobia, but hex, 666. Let me tell you a fun fact about the Bible. All those chapters and verse numbers, you have it, open it up, Revelation chapter 13 and 14. Those verse numbers you see there, verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, those chapter numbers, 13, 14, all those sorts of things were put into the text of scriptures a long time after they were written. They're not original to it. Somebody came by, and the story actually goes that somebody was riding on a horse, and as he was trying to dot it before it went to the printer, occasionally he hit a bump, and that's why you get some of these weird sort of beginnings of verses. All right, that's a rumor, but it's a fun story nonetheless. So when the books were originally written, they were written in Greek, and the Greek back then didn't even have spaces between its letters. It didn't have spaces between its sentences. It didn't have spaces between its paragraphs, or what we would call chapters today. It didn't have any of that. You'd had nothing, so you had to constantly use context clues to figure out where does an idea end and another one begin. So take a look at this really early manuscript of the book of Revelation. There you have it. So the earliest manuscripts in Greek were written in all capitals, so you couldn't even go off of that. And they're all just squished together. Now, if I was going to do that in English, we'd find it kind of troublesome. They had to do this all the time. So the question then arises, how do we divide our Bibles and our texts? So this was probably written, by the way, in the 200s. Everything runs together. So just think about reading chapters 13 and 14 of the book of Revelation. What this means is that today we've got to be super careful. We've got to be really careful, all right, not to let our chapters, our chapter numbers, or verse numbers keep us from making connections that John wants us to make. So we can, and the point is this, we can't understand the beginning of chapter 14, our chapter for today, without understanding what happens in chapter 13. They go together like a hand and a glove. Why? Just listen. Revelation 14, verse 1. Then I looked, and there was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him were 144,000. And they had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. So the 144,000 who were following the Lamb have something written on their foreheads. And the ones who are following the beast have something written on their foreheads. I remember growing up hearing about 666 and how it wasn't just the mark of the beast, but the sign of this one world economy, the rise of socialism, and because of that, the utter collapse of the world, right? You saw 666, and this was sort of like, and made it into post-apocalyptic films, and made it into horror films, and made it all these sorts of things, all right? It scared us to death. I remember one time seeing the number in a phone book, or in the call log. It was somewhere there, and I thought, if I answer this, if I call this, what's going to happen? I mean, this was a real thought. I wasn't just joking. You know, it had been ingrained in me that this number is not good, right? This is not good. Would I be cursed? Would the devil pick up, right? I mean, these things go on in little kids' heads. If I was reading a book that had at least 666 pages, and I wasn't a little kid when I was reading books that have 666 pages, but I remember hitting page 666 and thinking, I wonder if something important is happening on this page, right? There's gravity to 666. I would spend extra time on that page because I expected something special to be there, kind of like playing Led Zeppelin backwards, right? We think the 666 is something to do like that, right? I wasn't the only one, by the way. Hexakosoi, hexakanta, hexaphobia was a real thing. In 2003, the state of New Mexico decided to change the number of Route 666 to Route 491. Nobody seemed to have a problem with 491. But 666, who wants to drive on that, right? The Albuquerque Journal said afterward that they were glad to change it because now, and this is a quote, the devil is out of here. I thought that was great. I think they were sort of, having fun. It was a little joke, but the point is they still did it. The state still changed the number. Nancy and Ronald Reagan, after the presidency, after they left, they moved to Bel Air, California, and they had their address of their home. The house they bought was 666 St. Cloud. And so they made sure before they moved in to change it to 668 St. Cloud. Growing up, if we didn't fear the number 666, we worried about it. We wouldn't even write it. And I have to be honest, I've had trouble writing and now giving this sermon because of all the times I say 666 in it. A few minutes ago, Jamie actually asked me, do you really want to show this on the screen? And I said yes. Hexakanta, hexakosoi, hexaphobia. You're going to go home, by the way, and you're going to be saying that all day. And it's going to be awesome. All right, so why are we so afraid of the mark of the beast? Why are we afraid of this? John tells us. He says, in effect, It is by this number, 666, that we are made slaves of the empire. We're made commodities, in fact. We're branded. We're owned like cattle. We follow along where our masters lead, like every single cow in a John Wayne movie that you've ever seen, all right? Here's how Revelation puts it. Verses 16 and 17 of chapter 13. The beast causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, slave and free, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead. The right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell who does not have the mark. This is more than just a chip or a credit card planted inside of you. In fact, it really has nothing to do with modern technology at all. It has everything to do with where you put your allegiance, who you choose to follow, where you put your hope, where you put your trust every second of every day. Take a look again at another of William Blake's imaginations of all this. Next slide, we got it. Zach. There we go. A little smaller today. Anybody grab that light? Simon, thanks. So you can see it a little bit better. This is a really interesting painting of William Blake's. I know we've been showing a lot of Blake's paintings lately, especially last week. I'm fascinated by this one because what's so remarkable about this painting is Blake titled it, "The Number of the Beast is 666." And I got the biggest, largest version of this I could find on the computer, and I zoomed in, and I went like frame by frame, square by square, and I looked for the number, 666. Because he titles this, "The Mark of the Beast is 666." And I thought, oh, it's got to be somewhere. These guys put these things in like the craziest places, and it means something. I couldn't find it. Couldn't find it. He doesn't seem to focus on the number actually at all, which is strange because when I was growing up, hexaconta, hexakoisoi, hexaphobia, we focused on this number all the time. All right? Instead, he focuses on allegiance. Every person in the painting is shown worshiping the beast. And you're wondering, where are they? Down at the bottom left and the very bottom right-hand corners are a bunch of heads. It's a bunch of heads, and they're all praying and bowed down. But there's no numbers on their foreheads. This isn't because Blake was trying to say they don't have it. He's trying to say that it's not about the physical implant or the number. It's about what they're doing. It's about what they're doing. Every person in the painting is worshiping the beast. What you can't see is any actual mark, like I said, right? The only image, and this is a guess, of 666 and this whole entire thing is if you look at the red dragon, all right? The one above, the beast. The beast is the guy that's white. The red dragon is, well, the red dragon. If we could see it, he's got multiple heads, 7 of them. All right, he's got the main head right in the middle, and he's got 3 sort of like other heads on each side of his main head, and those heads have horns, and the horns are curved, and they look like 6s. And what's interesting, which is why I think this may be intentional, is you can only really see, of the 6 heads, 3 on each side, you can only see a horn for each of them. So you get one horn curved like a 6, another horn curved like the 6, a third horn curved like the 6, and then again on the other side, 6, 6, 6. For Blake, the number isn't what's important, though. It's whom we worship, the one who bears it. It's his name. You see, the mark of the beast is in Christian and Jewish thinking what we call the anti-Shema. Now, the Shema is an ancient Hebrew prayer of, you guessed it, allegiance. Allegiance. You all know the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States of America. Well, the Hebrew Jewish people had the same sort of thing, but it wasn't to the Hebrew nation, it was to their one God. Their one God. It would be written, get this, they would write it out on tiny pieces of paper, and they would attach it to their wrist or their forehead. Their wrist or their forehead. Listen to how Deuteronomy 6 explains it. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Then it says this, keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. The number 666 isn't some crazy branding, physical branding that the devil dreamt up. It's straight up idolatry. It's belief, it's trust in something not God, something other than God, something else. That's why it's 666, not 777. The ultimate number is 777. The one who tries to get close but can't make it, 666. It's putting your allegiance in the power and authority of human beings instead of in the power and authority of the Lamb who was slain. We've been hearing this message chapter after chapter now. Who are you going to trust? John says. Where are you going to put your allegiance? Who are you going to worship? Are you going to worship the Lamb, or are you going to worship the beast? No wonder then that at the beginning of chapter 14, what we see is the 144,000, they have the Lamb's name on their forehead. On their forehead. And what they're doing is worshiping. Worshiping. Look at verse 2 of chapter 14. And I heard a voice from heaven like the sound of many waters, and like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps, and they sing a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and before the elders. So the issue with the mark of the beast, the whole thing surrounding it is, who are we going to worship? Who are we going to trust? Which means that if the mark is the anti-Shema, the anti-Jewish prayer of allegiance to God, then the beast is the Antichrist, right? This is our first usage of that terminology. The beast is anything and everything that works against the Lamb who was slain. Last week, the Antichrist, the beast, was those weeds, right? The tares in the midst of all the wheat in our hearts. The things that always tempt us to do things the devil's way and not God's way. But now in chapter 14, John points out the devil's way is the world's way. This is where the meaning of 666 comes to play. It's not just a number, it's a name. When we started this series on the book of Revelation, we talked about how some Christians have recently, when it was written, some Christians had recently been persecuted by the Roman authorities. One of the major times in which they were persecuted in the mid-1st century was by an emperor named Nero. Nero, all right? Well, guess what? If you spell out the Greek words Nero, Caesar, and beast in Hebrew, if you take their Greek and you transliterate it like hexakonta, hexakoiso, hexaphobia, right, into Hebrew, all right, then what you get is they have a certain value. Each of them equals 666. You're like, what in the world? What are you talking about? Words make values. Words have numbers. What's going on here? The ancient Hebrews numbered their letters. Instead of using an Arabic type system, Arabic came later, right? Like 1, 2, 3, 4, like what we have. It was more like a Roman numeral system, using letters to symbolize amounts. All right, so you had this sort of thing. A would be 1, B would be 2, C would be 3, that sort of thing. So the ancient Hebrews used their letters this way. So Hebrew words could be used to express a certain numerical value, which means that John is saying with the 666, it's the beast, it's Nero. But there's a problem. Nero's dead when John wrote this book. Nero died in 68. John was writing in either the 90s or the early 100s. John knew Nero was dead. So what's going on here? John's setting up what we call a type. A type, a whole category of evils or temptations that we face. And Nero is just one example, one illustration of it. If we look over at chapter 14 again, we get another. It's Babylon. Babylon was the ancient empire that ended up conquering the Jews and taking over Jerusalem. They exiled all these people out into the east, into where Babylon was. The Old Testament book of Daniel, all right, which Revelation takes so much from, is a story of Jewish exiles living in Babylon and constantly having and struggling to remain faithful to their God in the midst of this foreign beast, this foreign power. All right, this is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's the story of Daniel and the lion's den. And Babylon is the great enemy here because it's always trying to gain these Jews' allegiance. Who are you going to follow? Is it going to be God? Is it going to be Babylon? Is it going to be God? Is it going to be King Nebuchadnezzar? Who's it going to be? Are you going to take the mark of the beast? Or are you going to take the name of the Lamb? So just like Nero, Babylon is also just an example. John is saying that any nation, any empire, any culture, all right, can become a beast. Any culture, any nation, any empire can become a beast if we worship our own economic and military might. That's why the mark, right, is the only way you can purchase anything, right? That's why the mark of the beast is said to be the only way we can buy or sell. All right, when we put all our hope in money, all right, then we've got a problem. When we put all our hope in military might, then we've got a problem. We become a beast and we take the beast's mark. So it's not just Nero or Babylon that's the problem. Persia did the same thing. Greece did the same thing. Rome did the same thing. We could go on throughout history and see dozens upon dozens of people and nations and cultures that do the same thing. They place their trust in these things. Who's it today? Who's it not today? There's another option, John says, though, besides taking the mark of the beast, and that's taking the mark of the Lamb, right? The name of the Lamb on your forehead, like the 144,000. All right? Take a look again at chapter 14, verse 1. Then I looked, and there was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, middle of Jerusalem. And with him were 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. These are the ones who have not given in to the temptation, John says. They're the ones who haven't given in to the temptation to go this different route in their lives, but they've sacrificed themselves, and they've sacrificed their pride. They sacrificed their ego. They've sacrificed their comfort alongside the Lamb. In verse 4, John calls them virgins. He's not saying that they've all got to be men. He says, they haven't slept with women. They're virgins. He's not saying that they all have to be men. He's simply crassly saying that they haven't slept with the enemy. They haven't slept with the enemy. They stay true to Jesus in the Jesus way. In their mouths, John says, no lie was found, for they are blameless. The question for us today, I think, is why would we want to take Jesus' name? Why do we want to follow the Lamb? And you're probably like, well, that's obvious. So let me ask you, why? Why? Why do you want to take that name? There's usually been two answers we usually hear to this question. The first is this: because God says so. Because God says we should. Why follow Jesus instead of the beast? Because God commands us to follow Jesus. Just last night I asked Emma, why should you clean your room? And she looked at me because she knows me way too well, and she goes, oh, Daddy has something he really wants me to catch on and answer exactly. And so I just gave it to her. I was like, because I ask you to, right? You should clean your room, Emma, because I ask you to. There's something important about obedience, right? And so I was a little drunk on power, we might say. And so I said, you should clean your room because I just told it to you to do that. So what's one reason we've been told in life to follow Jesus? Well, because God told us to, because the Bible says so, right? We do it out of sheer obedience. By the way, if you're wondering, that doesn't work terribly well for my daughter. It usually doesn't work terribly well for us either. The second answer we usually float for why we should follow Jesus and want to follow the Lamb, I also mentioned to Emma last night. The reason we were talking about cleaning her room in the first place is because as she was trying to put on her shirt over her head, she took a step, and she stepped on some of the junk that was on her floor, and it made her trip, and she fell and slammed her head into this toy bin, and she was crying and upset, and because I have very little compassion when they do it to themselves, this is a fault of mine, I said, well, Emma, why do you think you should clean up your room now? And it's because so you won't trip over everything, right? So why should we follow the Lamb? Because the Lamb wins, we think. Because we want eternal mansions and glory instead of eternal conscious torment in hell. That's why. So we follow the Lamb because of what it can get us. Because it's the better route to pleasure, I guess. So these are the two most common answers we give when asked why we follow the Lamb, but John gives a different one. John says there's a different answer to why we would follow this Lamb. We don't follow simply because God says so, or because we'll get a nice prize at the end. We follow because Jesus' way is the good way, the holy way, the blameless way, like he says in verse 5. Look at the next verse then, verse 6. Then I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven with an eternal gospel. The angel was flying in mid-heaven with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea and the springs of water." The next 15 or so verses of chapter 14 describe what this eternal gospel or eternal good news looks like. The good news for all time. All time. That all time will be important here in a minute. All right? And so this is the whole rest of the book, explaining what does that eternal gospel look like. But I want to pay attention to the final image that John gives. Special attention here. So if you would, let's read starting in verse 14. Then I looked, and there was a white cloud. And seated on the cloud was one like the Son of Man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to the one who sat on the cloud, "Use your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is fully ripe." So the one who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Then another angel came out from the altar who has authority, or the angel who has authority over fire. And he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Use your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe." So the angel swung his sickle over the earth and gathered the vintage of the earth, and he threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God, and the winepress was trodden outside the city. The blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for a distance of about 200 miles. I don't think anybody could have read it better than how Tom read this earlier. It had gravity to it that we need to hear. Blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for a distance of about 200 miles. Here we have two parallel images, scenes, with similar characters. The first we have is Jesus. He's called one like the Son of Man. This is New Testament and Old Testament, really shorthand for this divine figure, for Jesus. It's stand-in for Jesus in the New Testament. And this Jesus is told to go ahead and start the harvest because the time is ripe, and he does. Then we have another scene that does a very similar thing, except here, the one swinging the sickle and harvesting is apparently just an angel. So the question is, where'd Jesus go? And what the angel harvests isn't wheat, it's grapes. And the grapes are thrown into what the text ominously says, the great winepress of the wrath of God. Some folks interpret these two scenes at the end of Revelation 14 similar to kind of how we talked about that parable last week of the wheat and the weeds, the wheat and the tares. All right, harvest the wheat, put it in the barn, cut down the weeds, throw it in the fire, right? So You got the Christians on one side, harvest them up to heaven. You got the non-Christians the other, harvest them down to hell, right into the fire. Cut down the weeds, throw them in the fire. But take a look. Take a look again at the winepress in verse 19. The first thing we notice in this section is that the winepress is outside the city. It's outside the city. The second thing we notice is that these grapes of God's wrath aren't making wine. They're making blood. They're making blood. And they're making a whole lot of it. We're talking at least 5 feet, probably more. A horse's bridle was what goes on its head, okay? So I'm not terribly short, but I'm also not terribly tall. And when I look at a horse, I'm looking up usually, unless it's like, one of the small what are they called? Shetland ponies, thank you. Right? And then I'm looking down. But we're talking about big horses, all right? We're looking up. So this is high blood, all right? The image here is that we're covered in it from head to toe. Covered in this from head to toe. The blood flowing out of the winepress of God is so deep that we drown in it. But the most important line here is not how much blood there is, but where it comes from. And it comes, John says, from outside the city. Why does he say outside the city? In the context of Revelation, in the context of the whole Bible, the city, by the way, is Jerusalem. That's what he's talking about. It's the place where Jesus died and was crucified. And where was Jesus crucified? Outside of that city. Outside of it. And this isn't just some throwaway detail. It's a stock phrase when the New Testament talks about the crucifixion. The Gospels make a huge deal of it. Matthew and Luke, they tell a parable of a vine grower and his vineyard. A master in his vineyard, and it's a vineyard that's away from him, and so he hires out some people to take care of it, some tenants, and he goes to get his amount of income from it. And he sends some servants, and they kill all the servants, right? One servant after the other, they kill. So he says, I'm going to send my son. I'm going to send my son, because they're going to respect the son. And when the son comes, they decide to kill him too. But they don't just kill him. They intentionally, Matthew and Luke intentionally say this, they take him outside the walls of the vineyard, outside the gates, and kill him there. Outside the vineyard. So they seize him, throw him out of the vineyard, and kill him. This is a parable about Jesus and the crucifixion. It happens outside the city. So what do we have here at the end of Revelation 14? We have a picture of Jesus being both the harvester, the Son of Man with the sickle, and the one that is harvested. Jesus is both the grain and the grapes. Jesus is both the one who harvests the grapes and who trods upon them. And he's the wine that's pouring out of them. We've heard all this before from Isaiah. Jesus was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we're healed. John's saying this is the eternal gospel, not just the good news of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but the good news of Revelation 2. The good news all the way throughout history, all the way to the very, very end. The sheer amount of blood pouring out of the winepress, by the way, is unbelievable, but we're being told to believe it. God's love is poured out upon sinners here and for always. In verse 6, the angel pronounces the eternal gospel to everyone. He said, every tribe, nation, language, people. A few chapters ago, when we first met the 144,000, all right, back then John surprised us too. He said it wasn't just these 144 who were singing and worshiping God. It was every tribe, nation, language, and people standing before the throne and before the Lamb, and they were robed in white. They were washed with the blood. They were washed in blood. So what is God's wrath against? If it's against Jesus here in this image, what is God's wrath against? It's always against sin. It's always against evil, always against the powers, the nations, the beasts that are around us trying to deceive us. It's against the red dragon that's trying to devour us. If we make God's wrath against people, then we miss the good news of Revelation. God's wrath isn't against people per se, it's against the corruption that has taken over and dominated us. When Jesus sacrifices himself, he heals something inside of us, like an antibiotic going after an infection. This is what we talked about last week. He sucks the poison out from the serpent. The best description of God's wrath that I've ever heard is that it's the other side of God's love. God's wrath is the other side of God's love. It's not the opposite of God's love. That's how we tend to think about it. It's the obverse, like the other side of the coin of God's love. God gets wrathful when God's love is spurned or unreturned, which means that God doesn't pour out that wrath against us. God pours it out against what is causing us to hate him. God pours out God's wrath against the sickness that has a hold on our hearts. If you've ever wondered what Jesus' sacrifice on the cross actually does, it heals. It isn't an example of how much Jesus loves us. It does that, but that's not its big point. All right? It's certainly not divine child abuse, what happens to Jesus on the cross. What we have here is God giving up God's own self. Jesus' sacrifice makes the holy presence of God available to us in a way that we could never have known before. The author of Hebrews tells us that Jesus entered once for all into the holy place, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood, with the sprinkling of the ashes of a heifer. And he sanctifies those who have been defiled so that their flesh is purified. I always like to remember this idea that Jesus, his blood heals us, continues to sanctify us, to make us holy, to draw us into communion with him, with the Father, through the Spirit. I like to remember these points on the times that we celebrate communion, the Lord's Supper, because that's precisely what we're saying we're doing. We gather at this table, not just to say that we are one in the bond of love, but because we are one in Jesus, and that we commune with him. With him, we're brought near to the cross. Christ's blood moves us into the Holy of Holies, into that deepest part of God's own self, where we can be healed and whole. Healed and whole. So we come to this communion table today for the same reason each of us comes to Jesus in the first place, to find healing from our sins, from the marks on our hands and our foreheads. We come to get one step closer, to enter into his presence, to have him heal us. The blood of Christ continues to flow today for you, for me, as Dave will sing here in just a minute, for the whole world. So in a minute, let's let it wash over us one more time. Amen.